Hamdi v. Rumsfeld, decided on the same day as Rasul v. Bush, concerned an American citizen who had been captured in Afghanistan. Yasir Assam Hamdi was born to Saudi Arabian immigrant parents in Baton Rouge, Louisiana in 1980, and therefore was an American citizen. His parents returned to Saudi Arabia when he was a child, so he grew up in Saudi Arabia. He left home at age 20 to train at a Taliban camp in Afghanistan. His family claimed that he only spent a few weeks at the camp and tried to return home because he was disillusioned by the Taliban. However, he was captured by U.S. forces in Afghanistan in November 2001 and detained at Kala-e-Jhangi prison in Afghanistan. Between November 25th and December 1, 2001, an armed uprising at the prison led to a pitched battle that claimed the lives of 50 northern Afghan soldiers and hundreds of Taliban prisoners. Hamdi and some of the other Taliban prisoners who survived were transported to Guantanamo Bay. When it became clear that Hamdi was a U.S. citizen, he was transferred to a naval-based prison in Norfolk, Virginia, where he claimed he was severely mistreated. He was denied access to legal counsel until the government determined that his intelligence value was exhausted and there was no threat to national security. In January 2004, his father filed a habeas corpus petition on his behalf, and starting in February 2004, he was finally allowed to meet with a lawyer. The court decided two issues in Hamdi. First, did the government have the authority to detain Hamdi? And second, if so, what process, including habeas corpus, if any, is due to him? The plurality, led by Justice O'Connor, concluded that the AUMF conferred express congressional authorization to detain enemy combatants who were part of or supporting forces hostile to the United States or coalition partners in Afghanistan, and who engaged in an armed conflict against the United States there. Justice Thomas argued that the President's inherent war powers authorized the detention of Hamdi in addition to the express authorization of the AUMF. Justices Souter and Ginsburg dissented on this point. Justice Souter argued that the defining character of American constitutional government is its constant tension between security and liberty, serving both by partial helpings of each, and that liberty interests not well served by the executive branch, which focuses on security. The AUMF, Justice Souter argued, concerned only the use of military force, not detention. Instead, Justice Souter focused on a different statute, the Non-Detention Act, which states that no citizen shall be imprisoned or otherwise detained by the United States except pursuant to an act of Congress. He noted that, in a moment of genuine emergency, when the government must act with no time for deliberation, the executive may be able to detain a citizen if there is reason to fear he is an imminent threat to the safety of the nation and its people. But that this was not the case here because the detention had continued for 2 years and appeared to be indefinite. Justice Scalia, in an interesting coalition with Justice Stevens, also dissented. Justice Scalia focused on the suspension clause in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 2. He noted that the very core of liberty secured by our Anglo-Saxon system of separation of powers has been freedom from indefinite imprisonment at the will of the executive. The Constitution, Justice Scalia insisted, contains the suspension clause because the only circumstance under which habeas corpus can be suspended is when Congress specifically invokes that clause, which the AMF did not do. Indeed, he said, the AUMF is not remotely a congressional suspension of the writ, and no one claims that it is. Further, Justice Scalia noted, except for the actual command of military forces, all authorization for their maintenance and all explicit authorization for their use is placed in the control of Congress under Article 1 rather than the President under Article 2. Having determined that the government was authorized to detain Hamdi under the AUMF, the plurality then addressed the process he should receive. The plurality drew on Quirin to conclude that Hamdi is entitled only to process before a military tribunal, not in a civilian court. However, Justice O'Connor did not believe this entailed the power to detain a suspect indefinitely without any hearing. Instead, she adopted the balancing framework from Matthews v. Eldridge, a case that established a due process framework for civil regulatory hearings. The framework states that process due in any given instance is determined by weighing the private interest that will be affected by the official action against the government's asserted interest, including the function involved and the burdens the government would face in providing greater process. Under this balancing, the plurality concluded, a citizen detainee seeking to challenge his classification as an enemy combatant must receive notice of the factual basis for his classification and a fair opportunity to rebut the government's factual assertions before a neutral decision maker. Under such process, Justice O'Connor suggested, the proceedings could be flexibly tailored to the circumstances, including the admission of hearsay and a presumption in favor of the government's evidence. The case was remanded for proceedings consistent with these guidelines. You may note that Justices Souter and Ginsburg are listed as concurring in part. This is because they ultimately agreed with the plurality that the case should at least be remanded to the trial court for further fact-finding on whether Hamdi should continue to be detained. Does this mean that every person captured on a battlefield is entitled to a hearing concerning whether he or she is really an enemy combatant? No. Justice O'Connor was careful to stress that the requirement of due process does not apply to initial captures on the battlefield. Nevertheless, she rejected the government's argument that separation of powers principles heavily circumscribe the court's role. A state of war, she said, is not a blank check for the president when it comes to the rights of the nation's citizens, and the great writ of habeas corpus facilitates the court's role unless Congress suspends it. On October 9, 2004, less than 4 months after Hamdi v. Rumsfeld was decided, the government released Hamdi without being charged and deported him to Saudi Arabia in exchange for his renunciation of his U.S. citizenship and an agreement prohibiting him from traveling to the U.S., Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza Strip, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, or Pakistan.